The word of the Lord today comes from the Gospel of Jesus Christ according to St. Matthew. We shall find it in the 20th chapter, beginning at verse 1. Matthew chapter 20, verse 1, and we will conclude with verse 16. I will be reading from the New International Version of the Bible. For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire workers for his vineyard. He agreed to pay them a denarius for the day and sent them into his vineyard. About 9 in the morning, he went out and saw others standing in the marketplace doing nothing. He told them, "You also go and work in my vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right." So they went. He went out again about noon and about 3 in the afternoon and did the same thing. About 5 in the afternoon, he went out and found still others standing around. He asked them, "Why have you been standing here all day doing nothing?" "Because no one has hired us," they answered. He said to them, "You also go and work in my vineyard." When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, "Call the workers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last ones hired and going on to the first." The workers who were hired about 5 in the afternoon came and each received a denarius. So when those who came who were hired first, they expected to receive more, but each one of them also received a denarius. When they received it, they began to grumble against the landowner. "These who were hired last worked only 1 hour," they said, "and you have made them equal to us, who have borne the burden of the work in the heat of the day." But the landowner answered one of them and said, "I am not being unfair to you. Didn't you agree to work for a denarius? Take your pay and go. I want to give to the one who was hired last the same as I gave you. Don't I have the right to do what I want to do with my own money? Or are you envious because I am generous?" Verse 16 concludes by saying, "So the last will be first, and the first will be last." I like to use these verses and use as a theme by asking the question, is God always fair? You may go to your seats. One of the most difficult things I find with one of the responsibilities of being a U.S. citizen is to serve on a jury. The reason I find that troubling and to the extent of difficult is because the one who stands in judgment is really asking for divine intervention rather than human frustration on the part of those of us who are sitting in the jury box. Whenever a jury brings down a verdict, they are proclaiming an act that could transform an individual's life for all of eternity. A person could be put away simply because a jury decided to do so. In every case, both the prosecution and the defense are asking for justice. For the prosecution, justice would be a verdict of guilty as charged. But for the defense, justice would be a verdict of acquittal. Not necessarily innocence, but one of acquittal. In the Pledge of Allegiance, I got to be faithful to the lawyers who are here, because they're going to send me an email and say, "No, that's not how it works." In the Pledge of Allegiance, we say these words: "One nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. But hence the question, whose justice? It says justice for all or justice for some. Justice is really defined as the art of being fair, to administer that which a person deserves. Don't let this one pass you. Justice is to administer that which a person deserves. Underscore the word deserves. The cry for justice is heard every day all over the world, from the rebels fighting in Syria to the young people protesting in Brazil. The cry is always the same. We want justice.
Yeah, that's right.
One of the slogans we often hear is this: no justice, no peace. No justice, no peace. But when you come to really think about it, is this slogan actually calling for justice, or is it calling for revenge? Justice for many of us is based on where we stand at the time.
Yeah. Okay.
Where we stand at the time. And none of us, I suspect, will ask the book of the law to be thrown at us if we were standing where a victim would normally stand.
That's right. That's right.
When we look at justice dead in the eye, our prayer, Bernard, is always the same: Lord, have mercy.
Yes. That's right.
But once we find ourselves on the other side, we are saying no justice, no peace. The story of the vineyard owner and the workers is a classic case in which the action of the vineyard owner was called into question as being an action of injustice. Our text, Matthew 20, 1-16, is within the context of a much larger text. All right? In order to understand this parable as told by Jesus, you must hang out in chapter 19. All right? Now, in chapter 19, Jesus is leaving Galilee going on to Judea. All right? He's actually stopped in Judea as he makes his way, his final journey up to Jerusalem. As he comes into Judea, like a classic Jesus would do, crowds will gather around him. And within this crowd, there were a bunch of Pharisees. All right? They engaged Jesus by asking the question, listen, Jesus, what do we do about this divorce thing? Moses say that it's just the easiest thing to do. When she messes up, give her a certificate and send her on her way rejoicing. And Jesus said, no, hold up. Hold up to the bumper, baby. That's not what it's all about. All right? He explains to them about God's intention for the family. He moves on and he began to engage with children, and the disciples come to him and say, you got a lot on your mind, you got a lot to do, send these kids away. He said, hold up, guys. This is what the kingdom is all about. Yeah. And then a young rich guy came along, and he says to Jesus, what are the requirements for entering into heaven, to have eternal life? And Jesus said, well, keep the commandments. He said, which one? Because if you don't realize, I've kept them all. Okay. And Jesus said, well, that being the case, smart aleck, this is what you do. I know you got some stuff. Sell it, take the proceeds, give it to the poor, and come follow me. He said, wait a minute, that's not how the script is written. And he goes on his way saddened. And Jesus says to his disciples, how difficult it is for a rich man to enter heaven. It is easier for a camel to enter through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter into heaven. I'm spending time on this because if you don't understand this, you will miss what's happening in chapter 20. Yeah. This rich man came out of a culture that said, when you have earthly possessions, it's a sign of God's blessings. The disciples, too, had that same understanding. It's found in, they were not wrong. It's in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy chapter 28, if you read it, it will explain to you. But you have to understand, Jesus was ushering a new dispensation. Right? And so the disciple says to Jesus, but if this guy can't make it, what about us? We who have left family, have left fishing, have left everything. You mean to tell me that if this joker don't make it, we're not going to make it? And Jesus said, listen, guys, let's back up. When Jesus talked about the camel and the eye of the needle, Jesus is not talking about a sewing instrument.
That's right.
All right? Because for Jesus to be talking about a sewing or a surgical instrument, he is talking about the impossibility of salvation. When he spoke to the rich man, he was not talking about impossibility. He was talking about difficulty. Two different words, two different meanings. All right? He didn't say it is impossible for rich people to get into heaven. Don't get nervous, Pat. You know. The chair is getting a bit, nervous there because, But he's talking about the fact that and he was not talking about holding on to riches. Don't misinterpret it here. Jesus was trying to go against the culture. All right? He was trying to teach that don't get confused. Just because someone is driving the latest thing or living in the biggest house doesn't mean that I got anything to do with it.
That's right. That's right.
Don't be confused that wealth equals God's blessings.
That's right. Yes,
Don't get confused. That's the lesson he's saying here. Now let's go back to this eye of a needle. The eye of a needle was basically a hole in the wall. All right? Every city had a wall for protection. The traders would leave out at the sunrise and they would come back at sunset. But the gates would close at a particular time. And the mode of transportation was camel. Right? So you couldn't let the bona fide traders sleep outside. So when they got back to town and the gates were closed, the gates was not going to be open until sunrise. And so to allow for them to come home, they cut a hole within the wall of the gate. And they called that the needle's eye. And the camel had to get on all fours to go through. And now every now and then you got a much larger camel, and there was a sense of difficulty getting that camel to go through. And that's what Jesus was talking about. Jesus was saying just how it is almost impossible and difficult for that camel to get through, that's how this culture that you're holding on to and identifying your riches will pull you back, and it will be difficult to get you into heaven. And that's what he was talking about, nothing else. Nothing else. But then the disciples were very concerned. And you can understand why. They were not rich. They had left family, they had left the fishing industry, and they just wanted to be sure. All right, like in any good negotiation, you stop in the middle, you review. You come back, you say, this is where we are. Before we go further, let's be clear. Let's be clear that you did say 20%. Not 15, not you. Did you say it? Okay. We can move forward. And they wanted to be sure that they were not spending their efforts with Jesus just to be told at the end of the day, you're not entering the kingdom. And Jesus reassured them. He said, it's okay, guys. Everything will be fine with you. But if I was the disciple, I wouldn't be too happy with the way Jesus ended the conversation. Because in verse 30 of chapter 19, this is how, after he reassured them, this is what he said. He said, but okay, guys, remember now, the last shall be first, and the first shall be last. That's how he ends chapter 19. In chapter 20, he starts with the word for. For the kingdom of heaven is like. The fact that he used the word for is illustrative of what he was talking about in chapter 19. So the first verse in chapter 20 is a continuation of the conversation that he was having with the disciples.
Yeah, teach it.
Did I just do this?
That's right.
Boy, I'm becoming like Wesley, not doing this stuff. The fact of the matter is this. If you don't grasp what's happening prior to, you will miss it as we move forward. All right? Now, this particular incident that's happening in chapter 20, whenever this story is read, the aspect of justice versus injustice, fairness versus unfairness is always resurrected. The crucial issue for the first group of hired workers was this. How is it? How is it that we who were here from the rising of the sun to the setting of the same, how is it that all of a sudden we have become equals with those who came at the setting of the same? Gene, guess what? They were not here 54 years ago. How dare they get the solo part? That's not fair, Melvin. She was here for 54 years. The question that is raised, it's an interesting question. It was an interesting question. The workers, even though they had agreed to work for a day's pay, questioned the landowner reaction when he paid all of them the same thing. They certainly expected more than they had agreed to, which to their disappointment was exactly what they got. So too, my friends, before we become hard on these workers, every now and then, we call into question the actions of God. That's right. That's right. The cries of why me is oftentimes heard in our moment of grief and despair. In times of loneliness and abandonment, when sickness and death take residence in our home, when our relationships are dissolved, we wonder why, in spite of all of our faithfulness, God has seemed to take in a vacation. Like the workers, we call into question the fairness of God. God is not fair. For Job's wife, God was not fair. Therefore, Job, the best thing to do is curse God and die. Like the prophet Jeremiah, God was not fair. When he sat down in the ash pile of Jerusalem, he raised the question, is there no balm in Gilead? For the mother of James and John, God was not fair when he denied them the right to sit on his right and his left side. Oh, my friends, so many things in life, it's not fair. But whoever told you that life was fair? I can certainly understand these workers. I can understand why they were disgruntled. I can even identify with their disappointment. The call for the employer to take another look at the contract was not unreasonable. They fell victim to the problems of expectation that was not reality. They, like most of us, had developed a sense of comparison and entitlement. So they challenged the decision of the employer. However, they failed to see justice through the eyes of the latecomers. For them, the fair thing was for each person to be paid according to the number of hours worked. But is being fair always the best thing? The grievance was that they were the only ones who had worked for 12 hours. They were very much concerned about time. 12 hours, that's a long day. But so too was the landowner. The difference in the two perspectives on time was that the workers were looking at time from the standpoint of chronos, while the employer was looking at time from the standpoint of kairos. You see, chronos deals with human time. Chronos is where we get our word chronology. Chronos is measurable. It is sequential. Chronos is the reality we live in. Yes. Our watches and clocks are all based on chronos. Our birth and death records are based on chronos. It is therefore not surprising that the early workers' case was based on the fact that they had clocked 12 long hours. Yes. However, the employer's idea of time was based on kairos. Kairos is God's time. Kairos is not measurable. Kairos is not sequential. You can't change it, nor can you manipulate it. It is not verifiable. You see, Chronos operates on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 4 weeks a month, and 12 months a year. But Kairos operates in eternity. Kairos made it possible for Chronos to exist. What distinguished the employer from his employees was the ability to see justice from the perspective of the latecomers. When he does this, he quickly realized that the fair thing was not the best thing. When the landowner put on the spectacles of those who came in late, he realized very quickly that the fair thing was not the best thing. Now, I know we're all Christians in here. You know for a fact that the fair thing was to pay everybody for the number of hours worked. That was the fair thing. If I work 12 hours, give me 12 hours pay. If Ed worked 1 hour like he usually does, give him, give him 1 hour's pay. But what the early birds didn't realize is that it took a whole day's pay to feed the family. It took the whole day's pay to feed the family. 11 hours wouldn't have cut it. 10 hours wouldn't have cut it. Certainly not 5, and definitely not 1. You had to work for 12 hours in order to get enough money to feed the family. So this landowner, he called all of these fathers and he looked in the eyes and he realized, had he done the fair thing, some little boy would have gone home hungry that night. Had he done the fair thing, some wife would have looked at her husband as someone who is inadequate to support his family. This landowner was able to prospect from the position of those who were fallen victims of society. You see, Jesus understood this equation quite well. That when the Pharisees brought this woman who they assumed or said was caught in adultery, he looked at her, and the fair thing to do, according to the law, was to stone her. But Jesus looked at her and said, the fair thing to do in this situation is not the best thing. Whenever you position yourself from a standpoint of having the advantage, someone becomes disadvantaged. Whenever you don't take the position of the other side of the table, someone is left undone. Whenever policies are being written and those who are being affected by policy are not part of that process, somebody is going to be victimized.
That's right. Preach it.
Any decision that doesn't take into consideration all of the mitigating circumstances will always leave someone fighting for justice. And so this great employer looked at them and he says, you don't understand. You need to walk in the shoes of these who came in late. William Barclay in his commentary states that Jesus in one sense is sending a warning to his disciples. It is as if Jesus is saying to them, you, my friends, you have received the great privilege of coming into the Christian church and fellowship very early, right at the beginning. But in later days, others will come and you must not claim a special place just because you were here first. Because in the sight of God, all of humankind is precious. It doesn't matter when one comes into the kingdom of heaven, that one is precious. It tells me that in God's economy, there is no favorite nation clause. And this is what Aunt Martha and Uncle John meant when they sang, you've got a shoe, and I've got a shoe, and all God's children got a shoe. And when we get to heaven, going to put on our shoe and walk all over God's heaven. They didn't say some, they said all of God's children. Paul understood this when he announced that in Christ there is no east and there is no west. In Christ there is no north and there is no south. In Christ there is no male and there is no female. In Christ there is no Jew and there is no Gentile. For all of us have come short of the glory of God. Therefore, my friends, we are benefactors of God's grace. In many ways, all of us are latecomers. As latecomers, we have not lived up to our potential and responsibilities. We have been late in eradicating poverty. We have been late in hearing the cries of those suffering from oppression and abuse. We have been late, like the priest and Levite, who saw injustice and did nothing about it. In our spiritual life, we are oftentimes late. In our prayer life, we are late. In our mission, we are late. In our witness, we are late. In our giving, we are late. And how dare you question the generosity of God? It is easy to identify with those who came in early. If I could get up early, brave the rain, sleet, and snow, no mention bad drivers, and still get here on time, you should have done the same. Our world, I tell you, our world has neither the place nor the patience for latecomers. Those who arrive early occupy the best seat in the house. Those of us who come late, we go to the overflow. The early bird gets to pay cheaper in the parking garage, even though they stay the longest. I can't figure that out. If you book your airline ticket early, you get a discount. For those who are procrastinators, you pay a fee. But the great employer, Theron, lets me know that's not how the story ends. You see, Zacchaeus was a latecomer. Zacchaeus was so late that he had to climb into a sycamore tree. And Jesus saw him and said, Zacchaeus, come down, for I will sup with you today. You see, the woman who was dealing with an issue of blood was the latecomer. She was so late that when she got there, the crowd had gathered around Jesus and she couldn't reach there, but just a touch solve a problem. I tell you that the woman at the well was a latecomer. She was so late that no one was there to help her draw her water. But Jesus said, that's not how the story ends. For I will give you spring of living water. I tell you, my friend, God, who is represented in this context as the great employer, looks at our needs and he dispenses grace in such a way that Philly Yancey asked the question, what's so amazing about grace? Grace, my friends, is defined as that which God dispenses that we don't deserve. That which God dispenses that I don't deserve.
Yeah.
The word grace comes from the Greek word charis. It's the word where we get charismata, spiritual gifts, and that's the word we get charismatic. The essence of the word grace carries with it three connotations. One, grace identifies God's presence.
Yeah.
Grace identifies God's presence. Grace also talks about God's calling. And grace talks about God's power. Most times we water down the word grace. And we just think that grace is just something that we all just don't pay attention to because it's there. But grace carries with it the notion that without grace there is no salvation.
Yeah. Okay.
Together, these three concepts convey Paul's definition of being saved by grace.
All right.
You see, salvation, my friends, is not only about a place. Most of us are trying to hurry so fast into heaven that we are no earthly good.
All right. Tell it.
Grace is not about getting you into heaven. Grace is about relationship. Grace moves us from estrangement and hostility toward reconciliation with God.
Okay.
But check this out. Grace ushers us into the very presence of God.
Yeah.
Grace gives us access to the throne. Without grace, there is no access. The text speaks not of earthly inheritance, but the text speaks of that which we enjoy when we're with God the Father for all eternity.
Yes, yes, yes.
So my brothers and my sisters, it really doesn't matter who says what to you. As long as you're in step with the Master,
Yeah, yeah,
as long as you have a relationship with God,
yeah.
God welcomes you in his vineyard, and he dispenses grace in such a way that others will stand by and marvel at what is going on.
Yeah.
See, Jesus understood this very well because Jesus himself was accused of being late. Jesus understood.
Yeah. Okay.
He understood this very well. Remember, he had some friends called Mary, Martha, and Lazarus.
Yes, sir. Tell the story, Doc.
And something happened to Lazarus. Lazarus got sick. And Mary and Martha knew that Jesus had the ability to heal Lazarus.
Yeah.
So they sent for the friend Jesus
Yes, yes.
because they knew that Jesus could heal him.
Yes, yes.
Jesus, it seemed as if he didn't pay attention to the request.
Yes, yes.
Jesus went on hanging out with his buddies.
Yes.
A couple of days passed.
Yes.
And as the story goes, Lazarus died.
Yes, that's the story.
And the sister sent another email and said to Jesus, Jesus, I know you're busy, and that's why you couldn't make it. But rather than bothering yourself to come all the way here, don't worry, stay where you are. We understand, but Lazarus is dead. Jesus gets this email, and he sends a text to all of the disciples. And he says to them, rise up, let us be going. And they look at it, and they said, he can't be serious. When the guy was alive, we didn't go. Now the guy is dead, and we should go. But anyway, it's Jesus. Let's go. And Jesus, Theron, makes his way. And like the Motel 6, they left the light on for him. And to see him coming down and to run to Jesus, Jesus, oh, If only you had been here. If only you had been here, we wouldn't have been preparing for a repast. But it's lit now, Jesus. It's late. And Jesus looked at her and said, show me where you laid him. In other words, I don't have time for all of that. Just show me where you laid him. Jesus, he's been dead for a few days now. He's beginning to, show me where you laid him. Oh, Jesus, the stone have already been rolled over. Show me where you laid him. Jesus, we can't, just show me where you laid him. And Jesus gets there, he's walking, and he goes, Lazarus? 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 Lazarus! And they tell me that Lazarus came forth. He who was late was right on time. He who was late was right on time. You see, grace has a way of messing with you. I told this story here many years ago, but was said it would work again. When I came into this country, by now, all of you newcomers, don't try to place my accent. I'm not from the Caribbean. But when I was in this country, I'm getting older, some 21 years ago, I was a student, had not acquired any plastic, and a few of my friends and I were traveling down south, and we were hungry. It was early in the morning, Joyce, and we wanted some breakfast. And we kept seeing this sign, Cracker Barrel, 12 miles. And we'll drive Cracker Barrel 5 miles. Turn left to Cracker Barrel. We get to Cracker Barrel. And I put my hand in my pocket, I look at the change I had, I look at the menu, and the reality of the matter was the only thing I could afford was ham and eggs. So I ordered ham and eggs. They brought the ham and eggs. When they brought the ham and eggs, they set the ham and eggs down, I looked at it. There was something on the plate that was not ham and eggs. So I sat there, the lady was early in the morning, she was very busy, and the food was getting cold, and I didn't touch it. And she came by, she said, but what happened, Hassan? You're not going to eat? I said, I ordered ham and eggs. She said, but that's what I brought. I said, but there's something else on this plate. You see, I was not so concerned, Terry, about what was on the plate. I was concerned about whether what was on the plate was going to add to the bill. Because I could only afford ham and eggs. And then she said to me, oh, son, it's great. It comes with it. It's great, and it comes with it. You see, I stopped by to tell you that grace is like great. It comes with it. When you need it, grace is there. When you don't need it, grace is there. When you're up, grace is there. When you're down, grace is there. Because in Jesus, grace comes with it. God bless you.